Welcome to this deep dive. It is really great to have you here with us. I want to start by throwing a bit of an irony your way. You, me, everyone listening, we've been talking and listening our entire lives, literally since we were toddlers. We've been practicing this skill every single day. So why is it still so incredibly hard to make ourselves understood? I mean, why do so many professional meetings and personal conversations end in frustration, or someone throwing their hands up and saying, "That's not what I meant at all"?
Yeah, it really is the ultimate human puzzle. We tend to assume that just because we have vocal cords and ears, we are naturally competent communicators. But that is a massive and honestly often very costly assumption to make in any environment.
Exactly. And to figure out why we get our wires crossed so often, we're pulling from a pretty unique source today. We're looking at an internal training manual from Fubaya Mining, specifically their Supervisory Skills Development Program module on communication skills.
What's fascinating here is that on the surface, you might expect a corporate training document from a mining company to be purely technical. You'd think it would just be standard operational procedures and safety checklists. But this material actually functions as a masterclass in human psychology. It digs deeply into how our brains process information, how our egos act as roadblocks, and why we fundamentally fail to connect with each other.
Right, and our mission for you today is to unpack all of that. We're going to examine the hidden barriers that distort the messages you are trying to send. We're going to explore the actual physical mechanics of why true listening is exhausting and give you a shortcut to becoming a radically better communicator in your own daily life.
To do that, we first need to establish the baseline rule from this training module. It defines communication not just as the act of speaking, but strictly as the transfer of information. It states that true communication is only successful when it is understood by the receiver in the exact way the sender intended. If they don't decode it the way you meant it, you didn't communicate. You essentially just made noise.
Okay, let's unpack this because that definition is a lot more unforgiving than it sounds. The module talks about what it calls the simple model of communication. This is how we all wish the world worked. It's like a straightforward blueprint. A sender comes up with an idea, they translate that idea into symbols, meaning words or writing, and they send it. The receiver hears or sees those symbols, decodes them, and instantly understands the idea. It sounds as clean and easy as sending a text message.
It does sound easy, but that model completely ignores human nature. The training quickly pivots to what it calls the real world of communication, which is far messier. In reality, there is no clear, empty vacuum between the person speaking and the person listening. There is a thick, complex filter sitting right in the middle of that exchange. Every single message has to pass through that filter where it gets twisted, distorted, or sometimes completely blocked.
Right, and those blocks are what the module categorizes as nonverbal saboteurs. These are the underlying factors that can ruin your message before you even finish your sentence. There's a great quote included in this section. It's actually a classic lyric that says, "A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest."
That sums up the concept of confirmation bias perfectly. Personal values and beliefs form one of the thickest layers of that filter between two people. We are conditioned to hear what we expect to hear. If you bring a new strategy to a colleague that challenges their pre-existing beliefs or desires, they don't just politely disagree, their brain will literally prevent them from fully listening. Subconsciously, they will distort your words so the message fits neatly into their existing worldview.
That plays right into another major barrier they highlight, which is status and stereotyping. It's a trap we see all the time. They use a very grounded workplace example where an employee completely tunes out their supervisor. The reason isn't the content of what the supervisor is saying. It's because the employee assumes the supervisor has never worked as an operator and therefore doesn't know what they're talking about. The communication channel is dead on arrival purely because of an assumed status difference.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, stereotyping is essentially prejudging someone so severely that you shut down the receiver function. If an operator thinks all managers are exactly the same, they stop listening before the manager even enters the room. But status differences work in reverse, too. People in a perceived lower position often hold back. They won't share their true thoughts, they won't challenge a bad idea, or they'll just nod and claim they understand an instruction when they absolutely do not.
It all stems from defense mechanisms, which leads us to how self-esteem and trust impact our filters. I found this section particularly insightful because it breaks down how both extremes of the self-esteem spectrum destroy the transfer of information.
Let's look at the low self-esteem side first. People with low self-esteem tend to feel inferior, which naturally makes them highly defensive. When they receive feedback, even highly constructive, well-intentioned feedback, their filter automatically translates it into a personal attack. They stop processing the advice and immediately start formulating a defense. On the other end, you have someone with very high self-esteem who considers themselves so superior that they literally don't put in the effort to listen. They assume they have nothing to learn, and when they speak, that arrogance bleeds through, causing the other person to instantly tune them out.
And none of this functions without a baseline of trust. If you don't trust the person sitting across from you, your brain is entirely occupied with internal questions. You're sitting there wondering, why are you telling me this right now? Or do you actually agree with me, or are you just placating me? You end up trying to decipher a hidden agenda instead of actually hearing the message being delivered.
That lack of trust is severely compounded by physical distance. When communication isn't face-to-face, misunderstandings multiply exponentially. Without facial expressions, posture, and eye contact, we are robbed of the vital nonverbal signals that give context to our words. Think about how many arguments happen over telephone conversations compared to in-person meetings. It's a staggering amount, precisely because we heavily rely on body language to gauge intent.
It's so true. You lose the nuance entirely. And speaking of nuance, there's another fascinating nonverbal barrier here: negativity. It turns out human attention actually drops when we hear negative framing. When someone uses words like no, do not, never, or must, our brains want to shut the message out. But if you take that exact same instruction and frame it positively, using words like always, prevent, avoid, or should people respond significantly better, it's a minor tweak in phrasing, but it completely alters the effectiveness of the communication.
Which serves as a perfect bridge into the actual words we choose, or what we can call the verbal minefields. Even if you manage to bypass the body language issues and the personal biases, language itself is still a wildly imprecise tool. We often operate under the delusion that speaking the same language guarantees shared understanding, but English is incredibly ambiguous.
It really is. It's funny how we take shared vocabulary for granted. The module uses the word order to show how quickly understanding can fall apart. If a manager uses the word order, are they giving a strict command, like a military officer? Are they making a request, like placing an order for supplies? Are they referring to a control mechanism, like maintaining order on the factory floor? Or are they describing a mechanical condition, like a machine being out of order? It is the exact same underlying symbol, but the context carries all the weight. If that context isn't crystal clear to the receiver, the entire message fails.
That confusion is only magnified when professionals rely on jargon. Jargon is essentially an exclusive dialect used by a specific group. Someone on the floor might say, "The pump has tripped." To an outsider, that phrase is meaningless. Why not simply say, "The pump has stopped"? Or in an office environment, telling someone to reboot it, what you actually mean is shut down and restart your computer. Using jargon outside of your specific closed group doesn't make you sound efficient. It just alienates the listener.
Slang is even more problematic because it's rarely literal. If you tell an employee to hold your horses, there are obviously no actual horses involved. It just means do not start. But if English isn't their first language, or if they just come from a different cultural background, that phrase is completely useless.
This raises an important question about why people choose to communicate this way. The module highlights a very common pitfall, the complex word trap. People frequently use unnecessarily large words in an attempt to sound intelligent or to show off their vocabulary. It almost always backfires. It causes confusion, it can cause embarrassment for the listener, and ultimately, it fails the primary test of communication, ensuring the message is understood exactly as intended.
The list they provide, contrasting complex words with simple meanings, is a great reality check. Why tell your team you're going to ameliorate a situation when you can just say you'll fix it? Why promise to remunerate someone when you mean pay them? Or my absolute favorite corporate crutch, why utilize something when you can just use it? The goal of communication is shared understanding, not winning a spelling bee. Keep it simple.
I completely agree. Let's shift into a scenario that I think every single person listening has experienced. It's the memory trap. You have a conversation where you explain something clearly, simply, and without any jargon. You verify they heard you, and then, a few days later, they execute the task completely wrong.
And the immediate reaction is always the blame game. You get frustrated and say, why didn't you listen to me?
Right, but the twist here is that they almost certainly did listen. The actual problem is that they just forgot.
The data on human memory retention is honestly a little brutal. The training uses an activity called the TRAY exercise to demonstrate this. If you've ever done one of those corporate team-building exercises where you have to recall a list of items or instructions, the results are always staggering. Immediately after listening to someone speak, we only remember 50% of what was said, just half. And it gets worse. A mere 8 hours later, basically by the end of a standard workday, that retention plummets to 35%. The human mind simply cannot hold on to large amounts of complex auditory information. It evaporates.
The underlying science is that human vision is a significantly more powerful sense than hearing. We retain information much better when we can see it. If auditory information isn't rehearsed, written down, or recalled very soon after receiving it, it fades quickly.
So how do we navigate that? They provide a really clear breakdown of when to select which medium. You should absolutely use written communication, whether that's an email, a manual, or a diagram, when there's a large volume of information or a complex set of instructions.
Right.
You also need to write it down when it's critical that multiple people receive the exact same message, or when the specific details are vital to safety or success.
But there's a crucial follow-up rule here. You cannot just send a detailed email and consider your job done. You must always follow up important written communication with a verbal conversation. You have to talk to people and actively confirm they understood the written message. You need both mediums working together. The written word to combat the memory fade, and the verbal interaction to ensure the decoding was accurate.
Okay, this brings us to what I think is the most impactful part of this entire deep dive, the actual physical effort required for true listening. It is so common to assume that because we have two ears, listening is just a passive state of being.
It is a very dangerous assumption. Hearing and listening are fundamentally different things. Hearing is just a biological function. Listening, on the other hand, is a highly demanding conscious activity.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you are truly actively listening to someone, your body reacts as if you are engaged in physical exercise. Your heart rate actually increases, your respiration speeds up, and your body temperature rises. It requires legitimate physical and mental energy to hold your full attention on another human being.
And part of the reason it is so exhausting comes down to the processing speeds of the human brain. The average person speaks at a rate of roughly 100 to 140 words per minute. However, our brains are capable of processing and understanding speech at up to 300 words per minute.
That leaves a massive cognitive gap. You have a huge amount of spare time in your brain while the other person is talking. And what does our brain do with that extra capacity? It wanders off. We use that spare time to worry about what we're going to make for dinner or to stress about a completely unrelated project.
Or, even more destructively, we use that 300 word per minute capability to stop paying attention to the speaker and start formulating our own rebuttal. We rehearse our next argument or plan our defense while they are still speaking. We aren't listening, we are just waiting for our turn to talk.
And that perfectly sets up the negative listening behaviors they outline. When we let that spare brain capacity run wild instead of actively focusing, we fall into some really toxic habits. They outline 4 specific types of poor listeners. First is the interrogator.
The interrogator is incredibly common. This is the listener who constantly interrupts the speaker with aggressive, rapid-fire questions. Who told you that? Why didn't you do it this way? What makes you think that will work? The goal here isn't to understand the speaker's perspective. The goal is to cross-examine them and punch holes in their narrative.
Then you have the judge. This is the person who listens purely to evaluate and pass a verdict. They shut people down instantly with condescending remarks like, well, you're just being silly, or your actual problem is. They completely invalidate whatever the speaker is feeling or trying to convey before the thought is even finished.
The third type is the deflector, or the avoider. This is a listener who feels highly uncomfortable with the topic being discussed, so they actively try to derail the core message. They might abruptly change the subject, or they'll offer unsolicited advice, interrupting with, what you should do is. Another subtle tactic of the deflector is offering false consolation. They'll say, well, just look on the bright side. It sounds supportive, but it's really just a mechanism to shut down a difficult conversation because they don't want to deal with a negative emotion.
And finally, there is the ego. This one really gets to the core of human insecurity. We often operate under the subconscious belief that we have more to gain by speaking than by listening. We think that talking gives us control over a situation, or that dispensing wisdom and giving advice will earn us admiration and respect. And the flip side of that ego is the fear that if we just sit quietly and listen, people might think we are unengaged or not smart enough to contribute.
It's a profound realization about workplace dynamics. We talk to prove our own worth, and in doing so, we completely destroy our ability to receive vital information from our team. It all routes back to that 300 word per minute brain gap. To avoid becoming the interrogator, the judge, or the deflector, You have to consciously force your brain to slow down. You have to expend that physical energy to focus entirely on accurately decoding the symbols the other person is sending you.
So what does this all mean for you? Let's synthesize everything we've pulled from this source today. The next time you are preparing for a critical meeting or sitting down for a difficult conversation with a partner, keep these hidden barriers in mind. Remember that 300-word per minute brain gap. When you feel your mind rushing ahead to formulate your counterargument, catch yourself. Pull your focus back to their actual words. Remember the 50% memory fade? If the instructions are complex, write them down, but always follow up verbally. And above all, avoid the trap of trying to sound the smartest in the room with words like ameliorate. Keep your language simple and accessible.
The ultimate takeaway here is a fundamental shift in perspective. True communication has absolutely nothing to do with how eloquently you speak or how impressive your vocabulary is. It is entirely dependent on what the other person actually decodes. If your message doesn't land exactly as you intended, the communication failed. Period.
It's a very humbling lens to put over our daily interactions.
It is. And I'd like to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over based on that definition. If true communication is only successful when it is understood by the receiver exactly as the sender intended, then you have to accept a somewhat uncomfortable truth. Once a message leaves your mouth, it no longer belongs to you. It instantly becomes the property of the other person's prejudices, their vocabulary, their status assumptions, and their emotional state. It is entirely at the mercy of their filter. So the next time you speak to someone, really ask yourself, are you actively communicating with them, or are you just broadcasting your ideas into their filters and hoping for the best?
Are you communicating or are you just broadcasting? That is a fantastic question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time as we explore another stack of sources. Take care.